We are online.
Okay, well, welcome back. Um, the lecture today overlaps largely with the lecture yesterday. I will be repeating some of the things I said yesterday and elaborating on some of them. And the purpose is to show that, after all, languages are like cultural artifacts. So their technologies are part of our cultural artifacts. And as technologies, languages are mixed up technologies like computers that they have mechanical parts and they have logistic parts where, some sort of, we have to think of the different principles that we use to manipulate the phonetic units or the signing units um, on the model of programs that run our computers. And yesterday I started with that, and what we want to highlight is the significance of communication needs. And what I also want to highlight is that languages emerge and evolve concurrently with other aspects of our cultures. Like our social organizations were changing and becoming larger and more complex. And that kind of evolution itself exerted particular ecological pressures for communication because our ancestors, like ourselves today, needed to be organized in their social lives. And they needed to cooperate in order to survive, especially next to the large animals that were surrounding them and predators, but also because they needed food and they needed to go hunting and they needed to go and uh, get fruits or other produces of nature for their survival. But they also needed to attend to the young, and there was supposed to be, they instituted a division of labor between who attends to the young while the others are working, trying to gather food or trying to build shelters and those kinds of things. So these are the kinds of pressures that, like ourselves today, our hominin ancestors faced 300,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, and all the way today. And like yesterday, I want to emphasize the role of the mind as the driver of all the changes. The same mind that co-opted our anatomies for the production of languages also worked was a driver in the emergence of our of the different aspects of our human cultures. That's why at the end of my presentation yesterday, I said what distinguishes us from other animals is not language, as we have always said, as you can find in a whole lot of the literature. It is the mind, because it's the mind that produces language, unlike the minds of other animals. It's the same mind that produces different aspects of our cultures, including family structures and legal systems and so forth, unlike in other animal cultures. Okay, and the mind is a critical factor if you also consider Alex, the African gray parrot that could mimic speech, but couldn't invent language on its own. I just mentioned Alex. This applies to all the parrots that have the capacity to mimic speech. And what you also find out is that there are actually a number of birds that can mimic speech. that are very good at vocal learning, that can mimic other uh, vocalizations by other animals. But the interesting thing is that with our ability for vocal learning, we went as far as to create languages, but parrots didn't create spoken languages on their own. And because also the parrot can do that without having an anatomical structure that is like ours. That's part of what I showed yesterday. The bucopharyngeal structure of the parrot is not like the bucopharyngeal structure of the human being. That means that with the kind of mind that we are endowed with, even if we didn't have the anatomy that distinguishes us from other mammals or from other animals, we will still be able to create language. What that language would be like, we don't know, because we have to figure out what would be the alternative anatomies and how we could have domesticated those anatomies in order to produce language. But living in groups, social living, was a critical factor in the emergence of language or in the creation of language, because we needed to regulate things in coexistence with each other. Okay. And in the literature on language evolution, you will find a lot of references to cooperation. Cooperation is the ability to negotiate with your neighbor how you are going to live together, how you are going to do things together, how you can resolve differences between you. That's all part of cooperation. And here are just examples of communication. So the normal linguistic communication, which is accompanied by non-linguistic communication too. Normally when we communicate face to face, it's not just language that is involved. There's a whole lot of what we call paralanguage, like facial expression, like posture, okay, that are important in expressing our communication. Here you have an example of a signer. I think you know the scandal about this one that happened in South Africa when President Obama was speaking. There was somebody that was doing sign interpretation, but it turned out that he was just mimicking, but not really using sign language. Okay, and then here is an example we talk about using communication outside the body. And I said that using that kind of system that is external to the body would be expensive. It's costly because you have to carry the means of communication, and if you have to carry that external means of communication, that means there is a lot of other baggage that you cannot carry. Especially in this case, since this is made out of wood and it's heavy. Okay, there's so much that you can carry. At that time, people hadn't domesticated the animal yet to work as an animal of burden, to do things for us. Okay, we hadn't invented the wagon yet to put things in the wagon and pull. So we were a long way, and language had already emerged by then, so the solution had to be quite different. And there's also the other thing, you must be able to communicate while you are using your hands to do other tasks. So that's the ecological pressure. So we move to the next one. Okay. The other thing we have to note is language. We have debated whether languages are biological or cultural phenomena. And my answer is they are both. You cannot develop language unless you have reached a particular stage of evolution. and a kind of evolution state that distinguishes us from other animals because other animals have not done so. The chimps, the phylogeny of chimps is as old as the phylogeny of humans. So we are at comparable stages of evolution, but the direction that we took enabled us to produce languages, whereas the direction that chimps took will enable them to produce uh, languages. But if you look more globally, there are many aspects of our cultures that distinguish us from the cultures of chimps. Like regarding cooperation, for instance, okay, regarding production of music, regarding the production of fire, and our ability um, to process food, because some of the food items we need can be poisonous if we eat them raw. So we generally process food before we eat it. It may just mean cleaning, washing the food before eating it, or could be a matter of boiling the food item before eating it, and so forth. These things distinguish us, these practices distinguish us from other animals. So those cultural developments, they presuppose a certain stage of evolution that distinguishes us from other animals. And therefore, we can also say our cultural phenomena are also biologically conditioned. So the debate about whether languages are biological or cultural is a moot one. The question is, how do we communicate? And my answer is we develop technology for communication by self-domestication. And that technology is comparable to other technologies that we have developed. And therefore, by doing so, if we understand culture as particular ways in which members of the population behave, members of the population relate to each other and relate to nature. Therefore, languages are also cultural products, they are cultural phenomena. And cultural evolution is not independent of biological evolution. And what is the relation between language and culture? And as I said yesterday, it shouldn't be language and culture, because language becomes part of culture. If anything, we should be speaking of language in culture as we also speak of language in society. Okay. And can we really conceive of cultures as anterior to languages? I think no. We don't have to think of cultures as being static. Cultures are evolving, and we modify our cultures as we behave. We make adaptations depending on the people we interact with, depending on changes in our natural ecologies, and depending on our social organization overall. So culture keeps changing, but so are our languages too. The more cognitive content we have to convey, the more adaptations we have to make with languages. Okay. And so the changes that occur in languages are similar to the changes that occur in other aspects of our countries. Okay. And therefore it's difficult to say culture preceded language. Culture, other aspects of culture and linguistic aspects of culture have been evolving together. As we change, as we adapt to our natural and social environments, our languages adapt too and they keep changing, but other aspects of our cultures too undergo changes And as our knowledge improves, when it comes to technology, we also find ways of making our technologies more sophisticated or more adequate. And the same thing, we do it with our languages. So we shouldn't be thinking of languages like serving exactly the same communication needs 300,000 years ago as they do today, because the communicative pressures were not identical, because the level of our cognition was not the same. Okay. And so again here, that is a way of showing that our languages or language is not makes us uniquely human. Okay. It's in fact the cultures that we have produced thanks to a particular stage of evolution that we have reached, thanks to the particular trajectory, evolutionary trajectory that we have taken, that distinguishes us from other animals. Okay. Like we make tools in ways that other animals don't. Other animals make tools too, but the tools are very simple from our human point of view, compared to the kinds of tools that we make. And we build dwellings. Most other animals don't build dwellings. And if you go just by comparison with the animal the closest to us, the chimpanzee doesn't build dwellings. But guess which animal does? Birds build dwellings. The nests are, the counterparts of our dwellings. And according to some experts, there are birds that decorate their nests too inside. Okay. How? I don't know, but apparently this happens. Okay. And we have produced material art, and there is no evidence of this in other animals, although humans have tried to teach some animals to produce art. You may have seen documentaries where there is a big canvas and you give paint to an elephant, and the elephant blows the paint on the canvas and produces something that may be called art. The difference is that you have to teach this other animal to do it, whereas for us humans, this was an innovation of our own. Okay. Regardless of whether art was produced initially for beauty or for communication, but we innovated it and other animals did it. So, assuming culture denotes ways of behaving and doing things, as well as beliefs associated with a particular population. So, this is where we can speak of religion. For instance, we have developed religions of different kinds. And I don't know where I should say other animals haven't developed religions, because probably we don't have a way of testing this. But there is so far no evidence of animals building altars for spirits that are different from us and may have more power, or for gods. We don't have evidence of that yet, or we haven't discovered it yet. So should we not think of cultures as emergent rather than static phenomena? Aren't cultures like languages constantly being reshaped by the users or practitioners with no permanent states of equilibrium? We often complain that our children are speaking our languages in a different way, right? And then several generations later, somebody will say, "Oh, this language has changed." Okay. And when we come in contact with other people, we make adjustments. If the people speak different languages, our languages can influence each other, and then the languages also undergo change. Multilingualism is something very interesting. You can find multilingualism in some birds, but otherwise multilingualism is a peculiarity of humans. We can learn so many different languages. And that's probably one of the reasons why we say language is not innate. If you are lazy as a child and you want to learn to speak, you have to work at it and make sense of the means of communication that your caretakers are using to take care of you and to take care of themselves. And eventually, by 6 years of age, you can manage very well. By the time you reach puberty, you really fluent in your mother tongue. And then as you grow, you keep learning other things that become parts of your idiom. Okay. And that is, language is like something in the order of things in emotions, always in the state of flux, having temporary equilibrium and changing at the same time. Okay. So we can conclude that languages are manifestations of culture in the same ways that music is with songs and dance, religion is, we keep adapting our religions, and we see the emergence of new religions that we describe as syncretic. You are familiar with those here in Brazil. And our social organizations change too. So all these proceed together. So what makes humans uniquely human is the kinds of cultures that they have developed. Although modern cultures are outcomes of protracted evolutions over the past 3 million years or so. And so there we see the arrows that are projected yesterday. I'm not going to comment on them, but there is variation in the shapes of the arrowheads. There is variation in the shapes of the feathers used to balance the arrows when they fly. And then you see the buckets, and the buckets are designed, especially the handles are designed differently depending on whether the bucket is metallic, plastic, or made of wood. Okay. So here is another example, chairs. So originally we assumed that people made chairs out of wood. And so there are constraints imposed by the wood about how you have to assemble different kinds of things. Originally, people may have used strings to tie the different parts, but eventually we resorted to nails and bolts for wood. And the back is something that is attached to the seat. Now, when you have a plastic chair, you have more flexibility because you can just bend the same piece while it is hot and flexible, and you have the back of the chair and the seat, and then you just attach the legs, and then you have another one where everything is just melted and shaped together in one piece. Now people have invented artificial wood that requires a lot of heat for complex it requires a lot of heat, but when it is hot, you can bend the wood that artificial wood, and design these kinds of chairs that you can in a way that you cannot do if you just use natural wood. Okay. So technology, the material that you use makes a lot of difference. And here you have a wicker chair, just like there, and see how many designs you can come up with using wicker in ways that you cannot do when you are using wood or when you are using plastic to some extent. And that is why we have to really think that modality has an impact on how we develop a particular language. So we shouldn't expect a sign language to be structured exactly like a spoken language. When we use a spoken language, we have less flexibility with linearity. When we use a sign language, we have more flexibility with linearity. When we use spoken language, we have less flexibility with iconicity. Or if we proceed to produce iconicity, it is not exactly the same way that sign language can produce iconicity. There are a number of signs that more or less mimic the things that they stand for. Okay. We can also think of cultures as population phenomena, as characteristics of populations, because they are conventional by inter-individual conversions. And this is something that we do naturally. How are we supposed to shake hands? You know? Literally, you bring one hand against another, but there is variation, and there are ways of shaking hands that are more comfortable than other ways of shaking hands, and we become closer and closer. How do we dress? There is variation, but there are some conventions that we have to follow. Of course, here you have to make abstraction of fashion. Okay, eventually we wind up designing the basic shirt in the same way, the basic dress in the same way, and so forth. Although later on, with styles, we can introduce variation in the basic designs. Okay, and these are all products of a particular mind made possible by a particular stage of the evolution of the brain. And I think at some point I'm going to show the brain. Yeah, so we can wait. Okay. Um, okay. Ignoring differences in levels of technological achievements, the complexity of a culture reflects in part the complexity of the mind that produced it. And I probably should say the power of the mind that produces it. Although here I'm committing myself, maybe unjustifiably, to get bias for the superiority of human above all other animals, when we should simply be talking in terms of differences between us and other animals, and resist the temptation of claiming that we are superior to other animals. Hominin cultures must have differed in levels of complexity at different stages of the phylogenetic evolution, depending on what hominins could do with their bodies and their minds. And yesterday I gave you the example, the counterpart of this in ontogenetic development. You take a child. The child is born with a brain that is similar to the brain of the caretakers. The child is born with an anatomy that is similar to the anatomy of the caretakers. However, the child cannot do everything that the caretaker can do, because there is the factor of maturation. And this maturation, if you have ever taken care, raised a child, you see that it comes gradually. It's not a sudden shift from not being mature to being mature. Different aspects of the anatomy develop gradually to the point of maturation. Okay. And so, as the child learns to speak, the child cannot really communicate about all the things that it does communicate about. In the beginning, it's really a matter of basic survival. You teach the child to recognize the things that they can put in the mouth and the things that they cannot put in the mouth. The items that they should be able to name when they start speaking, as opposed to items they don't pay attention to. Okay. The whole lot of the communication between the caretaker and the child is filtered by the mind of the child, because there is a whole lot that comes as noise. So if you talk to the child about milk, the child pays attention. You talk to the child about food, the child pays attention. You talk to the child about temperatures in terms of hot and cold, the child pays attention. The child doesn't want to get burned. But if you use the abstract term heat, the child doesn't care. The child is not capable of that abstraction yet. If you start talking to the child about God, the child cannot make sense of it yet. The child has to reach a certain level of maturation before grasping some of these concepts. And as the child grows, I think parents, in terms of raising caretakers, in terms of raising the child, kind of grow cognitively with the child too, because the contents of the interaction between the child and the caretaker becomes more and more complex. And with time, the child's linguistic competence also becomes more complex and so forth. This is quite a challenge for people that think that we learn languages according to rules, rather than in terms of patterns immersion when we are trying to communicate. That's something else that I don't want to discuss at this point. But I just wanted to highlight this parallelism between ontogenetic development in language acquisition versus the evolution of language protracted over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. Okay. So the anatomy and the mind have always been two critical ecological factors driving hominin cultural evolution. So now we can look at the brain. I won't get into details, but the brain of the chimp is smaller than the brain of the human. It makes sense to say a larger brain is more powerful and more sophisticated than the smaller brain, but there are things that dispute this way of thinking. So, like, there are some humans that are intellectually outstanding, like Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, is said to have had a small brain, but he's considered to be one of the brightest philosophers in our history. Marcel Proust is one of the most liked writers in the Belles Lettres, and Marcel Proust had a small brain. Okay. So you don't go by the size alone. And if you go by the size alone, you can be misled because in some ways your computer may be more sophisticated than my laptop computer. Yeah, I mean your telephone. A telephone may be more sophisticated and more complex than my laptop computer here. So size isn't the only explanation. It is also the wiring that is part of the explanation. And our human brains became bigger in part because the cortex, the size of the cortex increased substantially and is much thicker than the cortex of the chimp. And developing a larger cortex, according to some neurologists, entail developing a wiring of the brain so that there are external connections from the cortex all the way to the base of the brain, which for all of us is the size of that of a rat, I'm told. Okay. And so a whole lot of the differences must be explained by the fact that we develop the cortex, the thick cortex that is responsible for many of the things that we do that things cannot do. On the other hand, when you look at the evolution from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens and then compare with the Neanderthal, Homo erectus had a smaller brain, Homo sapiens has a larger brain, but the Neanderthal had a much larger brain. And for some reason we survived, so if we depended on the brain alone, the Neanderthals should have been able to survive there must be other reasons why the Neanderthals appeared, but we now suspect that the Neanderthal must have been able to speak. That's what experts tell us. But we speak, and we don't really know whether Homo erectus was capable of speaking. And if Homo erectus was not capable of speaking, it must be because the wiring of the brain of Homo erectus was different in some ways from the brain, the wiring of the brain of Homo sapiens. But these are the kinds of details that we have to go into in order to explain why we started producing our primordial languages only 300 to 200,000 years ago. Some people speculated it was even later, 100,000 years ago, as opposed to the time of Homo erectus, which started about 1,500,000 years ago. So, and this also underscores the fact that only a particular stage of human evolution involving the particular stage of the evolution of the brain that can account for the emergence of language in mankind. So, evolutionarily, differences between humans and other social animals can be articulated in terms of the degrees of complexity of the cultures they have produced, including communication strategies. We talk so often about chimpanzees because we share 98 to 90% of our genetic material with them. But when you compare the differences in terms of cultures and in terms of linguistic communication, they are exponential. Okay. And I like to compare this to the way that computers have evolved. Over 100 years ago, computers took the size of a large room, big machines running with a lot of noise and needing a lot of cooling system in order for them to operate. And then by the 1970s, we had desk computers that were rather small, but bigger than the laptop. And at some point in the 1980s, people invented the laptop. And you know what a revolution that was. But it also looks like the smaller the computer gets, the more powerful it gets in terms of what it can do. Okay. And then at some point people invented the cell phone, and the cell phone was rather rudimentary, but as the cell phone evolves, you realize how many things you can do with your cell phone. And that's where you can tell the difference between the children we raise that are educated, raised with a cell phone, rather than people my generation, because you can do your banking with your telephone. You can actually read some of your papers on your phone and things like that. And I bet there are things that you can do with your cell phone that we are not able to do with other laptops. Okay. And the difference lies in changing the chips. A small modification of the chip has multiple consequences. Some of them predicted, some of them unpredicted, and that's where complexity lies too. And this is something similar to what happened with the evolution of language in mankind. We can say that the mind is what makes humans unique in the animal kingdom. Language happens to be one of the social products. The role of biology in the phylogenetic emergence of languages can hardly be denied. But culture is significant only if the typological variation that arises from the different ways particular populations have shaped their communication technology. In other words, we are all capable of solving problems. And we are all capable of using different tools at our disposal to solve problems. But we don't solve problems in identical ways. Okay. So an example I gave yesterday, you have a class, you have taught the same students, or the students have had the same instructor who you are, and you have had the same textbook, and then you give a test, and then if you check the answers that students give you, they are not identical. You wonder why. Our minds don't operate in identical ways, and therefore there is room for variation in the ways that we solve problems. And with experience, you also learn that there are very often no ideal solutions. We are happy with satisfying solutions that work most of the time, but not all the time. Okay. And so we can also modify our hypotheses as we face more and more evidence, more and more data. Okay. But also, even if you have the same tools, the ways in which we develop the tools, as I have shown with arrows and chairs, are not identical. So the material that you use for making the tools impose some constraints in the ways that you are going to develop your different tools. But also just the fact of having latitude in uh, developing more or less similar technologies in how you put them together accounts for that variation. So we don't all need 30 phonetic sounds to produce a language. Some languages get by with 50. Some languages use more. Why it is that way? Well, there is no clear explanation for that. It's just a matter of how, whether, for instance, they wanted longer words and you play well with your different 15 sounds like in Hawaiian, or they were happy with shorter words, but then you have to do different things, like languages that have monosyllabic words but use complex tones in order to distinguish between the different words. That's another strategy. Okay. Is there any reason why we should start a sentence with a subject rather than with a verb? No, it's a matter of choice because both of them work. Is there a reason why the verb should be in the middle and not in the end? No, that's a matter of choice too, and so forth. So you can compare it, for instance, in the way that we design our clothes too, they vary from one culture to another. Okay. And so that's really the cultural dimension. It has to do with the options that we have in implementing one particular kind of technology to solve a particular problem. So this is my little dog, Lily, that always gets my mind to work because Lily is very observant. Lily has her needs, and I'm not always aware of her needs, and she will figure out some way for me to realize what she needs at the moment, whether what she wants is for me to work her out, or whether she wants is for me to give her some treats, or whether what she wants is just for me to lift her and she can sit on my lap at the desk when I'm working and things like that. Okay. And I'm giving these kinds of examples because they are not necessarily innate. And the animal living with me, Lily, has communication problems to solve. And I have interpretation problems to solve. And somehow we converge, and Lily can use the same strategies over and over again when they work, and give up on the strategies that don't work. Okay. And this is basically how we must have proceeded to in developing languages. And we are populations. As populations, we are not really organized as like members of the sport team. We are not organized like, troops in an army. The rules of engagement are not clearly articulated. We go by trial and error. And we pay attention to what the neighbor does. If the neighbor's solution works better than mine, I copy the neighbor's solution and may give up on mine or keep it, don't really give it up because I may come across somebody that understands my innovation better than the neighbor's innovation. So we create what I have called the feature pool. The feature pool is where we have variance in terms of how to pronounce words, in terms of which specific words we have to use for certain things, in terms of how to put together some phrases. And like in a gene pool, some variants prevail and some variants become recessive. And they become too recessive, they may disappear, unlike in biology. Okay. But it's competition and selection in the feature pool. But competition here must be understood as the variant that is more likely to be preferred by the users, not the variant that is the strongest. That doesn't make the variants are neutral, but it's our attitudes toward the variants that make the difference. We may prefer a shorter word. We may prefer a longer word because it's harder to confuse with another, or it's like that. And different populations have gone different ways in showing preferences for the strategy that they have to use. And that's again a cultural dimension. Non-animals and non-human animals communicate too, but not linguistically. So we have to really make clear what linguistic communication is. And at the time of Ferdinand de Saussure, a language was defined as a system of arbitrary symbols used by a population to communicate. Okay. Nowadays in linguistics, we don't start with the definition of language. My position is that the more we understand about language, the more elusive it becomes, difficult to really characterize. Okay. But linguistic communication, we think of it in terms of small units that have no meaning on their own. And then when you combine them together, they create what we call words. And words are the units that bear meaning. And when we develop a larger vocabulary, we can break the words down to some morphemes. And morphemes become the smallest meaningful units in a language. Okay. And then we develop, well, there are patterns that emerge about how we put the morphemes together and how we put the words together. And we are talking about syntax here. And so we put a language together. For other animals, you don't really find it, although people that study songbirds tell us songs have some sort of grammar too. The songs produced by birds have some sort of grammar. Is the organization of that grammar similar to ours? Or should we just be saying, hey, we were not alone in developing compositional means of communication. Look, birds can do the same. Unfortunately, we don't know if chimps can do the same, but so far we have assumed that chimps cannot do the same. Okay. So, it's not evident that animals name different categories. We can develop categories without names. There are a number of things that I can think about. But if I were talking to you, I wouldn't know how to communicate about them unless I invent new terms, because they don't have labels. Okay. But other animals produce vocalizations, and if we explain the emergence of language in terms of exaptation, using things for functions other than they were intended for, then we have to figure out why we were able to exact vocalizations, domesticate them, and turn them into phonetic sounds, but the change didn't. Okay. The categories that can be associated with vocalization appear to be quite few in other animals compared to the vocabularies of human languages. And the categories we think here, for instance, of the particular vocalizations of change, one vocalization for instance, food, one vocalization for the presence of the predator, and so forth. And there aren't many of them. And the question is even whether these are labels, the vocalizations they produce, or whether they are just instinctive reactions and they make them differently. But then people tell us, hey, wait a minute, don't come to those kinds of conclusions, because among the change the young have to learn from the adults in which way you have to vocalize when you find food, and in which way you have to vocalize when there is a predator, and in which way you have to vocalize when there is a specific predator. Okay. Those of you that have dogs here, those of you here that have dogs, have you noticed different ways of barking in your dogs? Because Lily has taught me that. Okay. And the barking that we recognize the most is that when the dog comes across another dog, they don't like each other and they bark vehemently at each other. But a dog barks differently when if you step on the toe and you cause them pain, they don't bark the same way. Okay. And if they need some sort of attention, they will bark a different way too, and so forth. Okay. And this is significant. So it looks like it's something that we have had naturally if we associate, compare ourselves to other animals. We just have elaborated the system to a larger extent, to the point where we would need syntax in order to put our different barkings together and produce sentences. Okay. So we have been quite anthropocentric in the ways that we communicate about ourselves and about other animals. But one thing that we all share that has played an important role in the evolution of language is joint attention. So you will find groups of people standing and all staring at something that happened. Have you seen places where the car traffic slows down because everybody is paying attention to an accident? Okay. And animals do that too, they have joint attention. Okay. But we really need joint attention for language to work. Okay. So, yesterday I produced a sentence, and I hope that you interpreted it adequately because we were all focused on the length of my presentation and so forth. And I said, I'll be shorter. And I'm sure that you didn't expect me to shrink from yesterday to today, because I will put it the same way. I'll be shorter. Okay. Or if I were to stand next to people of different heights, and then I can say I'll be shorter next to Frank, but taller next to Harry. Okay, this is certain. And so joint attention helps us come with the right interpretation. So, in other words, although a lot of us say we are not mind readers, when we are sarcastic and you don't want to interpret the right way what somebody has said. It happens a lot between spouses. then, but when you pay attention to it, we are very good mind readers because a whole lot, even if I use the wrong term in a particular context, you guess what I wanted to say and you can help me out by suggesting the right term, right? Because of joint attention. And we find evidence of this in other animals too, and I think domestication of pets works so well because we share joint attention, the capacity for joint attention with our pets. The question is, how far do we go beyond that? And we are going further, and that is part of our a consequence of our biological evolution, a consequence of the fact that our social practices have also evolved much further. Okay. And but the basic of it, we share it with other animals, joint attention, and even mind reading. There are cases where I suspect little Lily is a better mind reader than I am, because little Lily can guess my moves and what I'm planning to do before I can guess what little Lily is scheming to do in the house. Okay. And the Lily can anticipate my reaction to of certain things in ways that I cannot really anticipate towards her. Okay. So we still have to see non-human animals engaged in something close to a conversation. Okay. And that is one of the big differences. And this is a consequence of the kinds of languages that we have developed. And one thing that I pointed out yesterday, the capacity for term taking, which we start with when we are only babies, and we play with the caretakers in taking turns in humming. Okay. So, I submit that languages are technologies. The problem to solve was to establish efficient, high fidelity communication between individuals living together. Because we need this to interact in interacting with each other. And we realize that we have a lot to gain in cooperating. And we find it necessary to share thoughts, feelings, and perspectives on our experiences, and thus to learn from each other. And I already explained the payoff. We accumulate knowledge faster, even on the population level, and we make more cognitive progress this way, because if we have to wait for everybody to invent the language, we wouldn't go very far. And if we had to wait for everybody to develop, to solve their problem on their own, we wouldn't go very far. But if we work together, we can point out what we want to work in, what the other person is doing, or what the other person is doing better than I do. And in learning horizontally from each other, we just develop more collective knowledge. Okay. And there's a role of scaffolding. We build something on something that exists already. So languages are emergent and collective technologies, and they evolve piecemeal, incrementally. That's what I tried to show yesterday. And the things that we call rules in linguistics are probably no more than patterns that emerge in the way that people use languages. And I think that there are differences between people like me that have learned, say, English in school, and then have been applying English, and people like Chris that both learn English as a mother tongue. Okay. A lot of the rules that I apply, that I learned, if I apply them literally in many cases, they are going to lead me to produce hard sentences. Like I remember when I started teaching, and I wrote a small questionnaire, and in my questionnaire was something like the parent gives the child away for adoption. And one of my students said, no, you don't say give away a child, you say give up a child for adoption. Okay. So when you are dealing with so many prepositions, you don't know what the conventional pattern is. Okay. And a lot of us have problems with using prepositions in a foreign language. That's where you see the role of patterns. You must be accustomed to these patterns as they emerge, as the frequency uh, in which certain collocations are used as opposed to other collocations. So here comes the legal that says we are going to write a grammar and we are going to consider this particular rules. It's a nice attempt. If it works, it is equivalent to what works in the mind of the speaker, but I don't really believe that the things that we call rules are really like that in our minds. Okay. But it's a matter of habits, how you do it. Okay. So we are often typically focused on communication in the here and now. And we don't really think of the rules as we should use them. We think of what we have, how we have heard other people put words together when they speak, or how we have seen other people put signs when they sign, and so forth, and these habits accumulate. Okay. So native speakers are not the best people to tell you about the rules of grammar that we learn in school, because they don't rely on those rules. And we rely on rules that have been written in books, and we produce these things that native speakers find funny, or these that can tell us you speak like a book. Okay. So here you find these differences. Okay. And there's the role of feedback. We give feedback to each other. The feedback comes in the form of correction, but the most immediate feedback comes in the form of not being understood or being understood. If you haven't been understood there, you get immediate feedback. You have to figure out what went wrong in the way that you express yourself. So the phylogenetic emergence of language is exactive and provides ample evidence for both scaffolding and generative entrenchment. Generative entrenchment is what you started with, is what you don't take out, and is what you build everything on top of. So the most primitive aspect of scaffolding, which we share with many other animals, lies in the co-option of breathing mechanism for the production of vocalization. Okay. If you run and try to speak, you don't speak the same way because it disturbs the way you normally speak. In storing a lot of air, intaking a lot of air, and then releasing the air out only slowly so that you can complete your utterances, otherwise you are harmed. But I just illustrated when you lose the wind coming from the lungs. A peculiarity of hominins lies in the exaltation of the masticatory anatomy for the production of speech and of hand motions for signing. As technologies, languages are practical, not costly in terms of energy and transportation. Does it mean we went for optimality? I really don't know. but we went for something that costs less energy than some other alternative that we could have considered. Then the material use constrained how linguistic communicative technology would develop with the mind always in control. And the acoustic materials impose linearity that meant using the possibility of pauses to tell where one would or where one word or phrase ends and the other starts. You can make breaks only in some places. If you do it in different places, it doesn't work. I don't know if you have the 1010 comic book. There's one particular book on the lost mask that investigators were trying to find out. And in there is a passage where the English words are cut at the wrong places. Part of one word goes with the other preceding word, and the other one stays alone or with another word, but the other word is cut. And the language is called Arumbaya. And when my daughter was 8, we were reading together. And the first time we couldn't make sense of it. And then I paused. And then I bunched everything together and separated the worst one from the other and so on and started reading it. And that was supposed to represent speaking English with an accent in the way that the words were cut. And so my daughter sat down and waited and said, I think it has an advantage of having a father that is a linguist. Because before that she was telling me, Daddy, don't waste your time on that. There's another language you want to understand. So, but these are the kinds of constraints that we have to deal with. What are the moments when you can stop briefly or imperceptibly and make an intake of air and then continue to speak? Or when you are stuck and looking for a word, when can you stop? You cannot stop in the middle of a word. It will be confusing to an interlocutor. You have to stop at the end of the word. And when we follow different people speaking, there must be a way in which we can identify the different words because everything comes in a continuous stream. So when do we know that this is a word here that is connected to the following word and things like that? I think it becomes more complicated in languages such as French, where you can have this phenomenon called liaison. So, l'eau for water is that one word or two, but you cannot say la eau. You just have to say l'eau. How does this happen? And there is some syntax of sounds within words, and we call that phonology, to distinguish words from each other. Okay. So if I say pin and another person says nip, the same sounds are used, but because of the syntax in these particular words, we tell them as two different words. And then from there we can extract the syntax within the words to develop syntax between the words. So Tom likes Harry does not mean the same thing as Harry likes Tom. The same words are combined in different ways with very different meanings. Okay. Signing is less subject to linearity, but it can be more iconic and allows the conflation of several chunks of meanings into one word. I gave the example of the snake slithered very fast up the tree where everything is just cut in one complex sign. So scaffolding is not limited to the material aspects of language conceived of as hybrid technology. I don't know whether we should have a break at this point or
Yeah, it's
have a break.
Yeah.
Okay. We trust that you will come back. It's for 15 minutes. We agree it's break for 15 minutes and then that's it.
yes. Then
We come back.
yeah.
So I want to explain scaffolding here. Is that there is usually in the way that languages evolve, um, the increments are based on something that is already working, and you do something different from there. So you take, for instance, naming. It's not absolutely new because we have been able to point. And as far as I can tell, other animals don't point, but we humans do. So if we were using a different means of communication, pointing would do a good job. And that it can do a good job, uh, we can see that we haven't given it up when we communicate face to face. This Lucy and that Lucy. I need a pointing. Okay? This and that and that. Pointing words. However, if we have names for different objects, we can do more. We can say uh, Paul Barrett and Paul Giles without necessarily pointing. And when I say Paul Barrett, it means one Paul. As I say Paul Giles, it means another Paul. But the other thing is that when I don't see Paul, I can still name Paul. And people will know which Paul I'm talking about if we all know the same Paul. Okay, you follow here? And so this makes language less dependent on the here and now. We can talk beyond more than the here and now. And naming gives us that capability. We call it displacement. You don't have to talk about what is present. You can also talk about what is not present. Okay. Later on, we can correlate this in language with the addition of tenses to situate things that we are talking about in the past or in the future or in the present. Okay. And then we realize that we cannot just be naming things because we wouldn't be going very far with them. We need to say what other things we want to say about the certain things that or certain entities that we name. And that is known as predication. So I can say Larry is sick. Larry left the room. Sick is the predication. Left the room is the predication. First, I'll draw your attention to Larry. And then I say, tell you more about Larry in this particular sentence. So, linguistic communication becomes more informative this way. Okay? And I have given you the example in another form. There must have been a time when instead of is and was or whatever, all I had to say was Larry sick. Larry out the room, something like that. But as time went by, we realized that that predication in that way, although it is informative, it doesn't tell us a whole lot about the time of the state of affairs that I'm reporting to you. And we realized that instead of proper names, we also use words that we call common nouns. And then when we use common nouns, we want to make clear whether we are talking about a referent that we know or a referent that we don't know yet. So I saw the girl versus I saw a girl. There's a difference. And that's why we need particles that we call determinants when we use common nouns. I saw this girl, not that girl. It makes a whole lot of difference. So we make what technically is known as the difference between denotation, connecting a label with an entity or a class of entities, versus reference, situating that entity in time and space. And saying how you are referring to that entity as a class or as a subset of the class, known or unknown. Okay? I was chased by the dog versus I was chased by a dog don't mean the same thing. Okay? Or the dog chased me, or a dog chased me don't mean the same thing. And so little by little, by adding all these things, it's not clear in which order. But this is what seems to have happened in the evolution of language. Okay. In a paper I published, Language as Technology, I tried to suggest a modern sample. I said I give up because I cannot decide which one came first. Okay. And then we also realized that while we are talking about what syntacticians will call arguments, so the constituents that serve as the function as subject or as object or in another function. Instead of using nouns, we can use other things. Like, I like reading books. And reading books is a verb phrase. But when you think about it, the verb phrase is functioning in this sentence as a counterpart of a noun. And that's why in English you have to put a special marker on read, the ing here, that says is read not really as a verb, but as part of a nominal phrase that is based on a verbal construction. We make all these adjustments so that we are able to communicate ideas without necessarily inventing new words for things that are happening now. And we rely on the ability of the interlocutor to recognize patterns and to make sense of the new combinations of words. So current structures can also be exerted to generate new structures. And I gave you the example of complement clauses in I like reading books. But there are also cases of grammaticalization where a word, a lexical item that functions like a verb can be changed into another function. So the verb to go is a verb of motion. It really means motion from one place, location to another location. Then we want to express the future. And we think of travel in time as similar to travel in space. And so we say, I go by a book. So go expresses future and the direction is by a book. But we have to make adjustments because if I just say I go by a book, it's not consistent with the grammar of English that we know, that if you have the verb go in the present, you have to put it in the progressive. So you have I going by a book, but that is not good enough because when you change the verb into the form going, this time you use the copula before it. And so eventually we come to I am going to buy a book. And before you know it, going to becomes a marker of the future, and as a marker of the future, you can now contract it. And so native speakers can tell you, I'm gonna buy a book. Where going to is coalesce into Ghana as a marker of future. That's part of the grammaticalization process. It's part of the scaffolding process. You work on things that work already and you develop new functions for them. That's what in the language of biology is known as exaptation. This is the same thing as co-option. Okay. And this also provides evidence for generative entrenchment, that there are some basic structures that we haven't got rid of, but we have built new structures based on them. And other question that you can ask, why didn't languages emerge wholesale in a catastrophic kind of way? We dealt with that yesterday. First of all, the evolution of human anatomy was gradual, and the evolution of the human mind was gradual. And there is no way that the mind of Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago could have supported the language that we call English or Kiswahili or Japanese or whatever, because it would have been too complex for their minds. But also the communication needs were not exactly the same as those that we face today. And the communicative needs were not identical. Therefore, languages had no alternative but to evolve gradually and always adapting to the current communicative needs of the speaker or signer, but also adapting structurally to what the mind can handle. And that's one of the problems when we talk to our pets. The pet can guess a number of things, but the pet cannot really process our utterances because the structures of our utterances are too much for them to handle. On the other hand, you will notice that your pet knows what the word dog means, what the word food means, what the word water means, and they will recognize all this, except that when you put them in sentences, there's another problem. Okay. So you can interpret the rest of the sentences you use in communicating with your dog as part of fatty communication. It's interesting, the dog knows that you are sharing attention, you are joint attention, and that you are connecting with them. But the specifics of what you say, the dog may not understand at all. The dog may eventually understand some phrases, come here. The dog may eventually learn to respond to that. Go away, get away, you know. The dog may make sense of that, but there are certain things that the dog will not be, many that the dog will not understand at all, and the dog is just well off being quiet and watching you until the point where they get the message that they understand and they react to it. And what we have to emphasize here is linguistic behavior is social interaction, subject to social conventions known as norms. Okay. And so the norms, they are tacit agreements, patterns that have emerged from the convergence of our behaviors. And I say convergence here because individual A develops some strategies, individual B develops some strategies. Somehow they have to get to where the strategies that are using are mutually intelligible to each other. And there are two ways in which they become intelligible to each other. Everybody learns the other system, and then they are mutually intelligible. But another way is that they converge in using more or less the same words and more or less the same structures. And that's where they can say, we speak the same language. And that is part of the cultural dimension. It's the same thing with cooking. You cook your dish this way, I cook my dish that way. But if we are going to eat together, either we keep two separate recipes or we merge them into one recipe. And it becomes our family favorite dish or whatever. And we can have another of them. We kind of reduce variation. And these are the norms. That's the cultural dimension. Okay. So how we name what we communicate about, including what meanings we must associate with them, is part of the conversions in behavior. How we pronounce the words of our languages is part of the conversions. How we combine the words into phrases, that's part of the conversions in our behavior. How we take turns in conversation, that is also part of our behavior. And it's all conversion. We can differ in some ways, but we try to converge the best way we can. So developing what we call social norms, communal norms. That's the cultural dimension. Biology enables you to produce forms, to produce structures, but how our individual structures are going to become similar to each other, that's the cultural part of it. Okay. So norms represent a kind of ritualization in the ways that we use language. They are immersion patterns in the sense that no authority stipulates them for the rest of the speakers or signers to follow. Where people have invented academies, we all know to what extent we ignore the stipulations of the academy and pay more attention to the vernacular ways in which we do things, we speak. Okay, and we are nonetheless creative in the way we choose words and combine them into longer utterances to communicate information. And there is some sort of ritualization there, where, for instance, we agree that when we speak, the subject in Portuguese is going to come first, and then the verb will come next, and the other complements will come later. And we also know how to ask a question, whether I don't know if in Portuguese we do like French, you have inversion between the subject and the verb. Okay. But in French, you have to do it that way. Okay. So, in order for languages to work, we need cooperation. We really help each other. If you paid attention, you would be surprised or shocked by how often we say things inaccurate. But your interlocutor selects the interpretation that is the most fitting for the situation and ignores the deviation. Okay. And the payoff for that includes growth of knowledge, but also the formation of, let's call it a system for us linguists that works. And in order for us to have the kind of system that we are going to call our language, English, French, Japanese, Swahili, Kimbundu, or whatever, we need that cooperation. And cooperation also has been critical in managing large population sizes. We have invented kinship structures. Okay. So because that helps us determine who we can prioritize when we practice altruism. Altruism is doing something that benefits the other person, the other party. And relations between kin groups are determined by what kinship roles we have attributed to each other. You don't behave toward your father and mother the same way that you behave toward your sister or brother. Okay. Or in some cultures, the same way that you behave toward your cousin and your sibling. I come from a culture where there is no distinction between sibling and cousin. Okay. No distinction between parent and uncle or aunt, because the categories are defined differently. And these are all parts of the conventions, and they are aspects of what we call culture. And these differences, we can compare them to the variation that we find across different languages and interpret them also as aspects of culture. Okay. And then there were contacts or interactions between bands or villages, and because when there are contacts, you either learn the other language or you are multilingual, or your languages influence each other and they become a new language. And then we can manage things better between the two communities in contact. We can manage conflicts, we can find solutions by talking to each other. And there are political systems that have emerged to regulate large populations. Okay. And those are cultural aspects of our societies, and languages fall in the same category. Okay. So in both all these cases, we can speak of the emergence of norms of conduct or norms of linguistic behavior, which need not be articulated explicitly. We just know that. We know that you have to greet a person this way and not another way. That you have to establish eye contact that is preferred when you are communicating. Although in some other cultures, if you are talking to a person that is senior to you, you avoid eye contact, especially if the person has a lot of power. So explicit, elaborate linguistic communication becomes more critical in these cases, but getting there also requires a lot of cooperation, and that's the force of society, and that is how cultures emerge in society. Okay. Why is there typological variation? Well, because we have alternative ways of solving problems, but also because the materials that we use are not exactly the same. Okay. And I talked about this yesterday, I don't need to go over it again. And also about population that use different technologies that part, if we are similar in our anatomical structures and we are similar in our mental structures, chances are high for us to develop similar solutions if we work with the same materials. And this is what has happened. This is how people that do syntax or linguistics talk a lot about universals, and universals are the kind of things that are shared by the different languages, but people also talk about typological variation, and there is a tendency to say there are strongly universal correlated with different types of languages than others. And there are probably more typology dependent universal contained within particular types of languages than really sweeping universals that apply to all languages. We know that we use similar materials, that's a universal. We use, and if you use sounds, you are bound by linearity. We know that it is also conventional to be assign words to different lexical categories. What we can do with nouns is not exactly what we can do with verbs, is not exactly what we can do with adjectives and so forth, and still you're going to find variation. Okay. And why aren't there populations that resorted to technology outside the body? For some reason, it looks like the ecologies in which we have evolved have favored domesticating our own anatomies to using materials outside the body, especially since we move around. Okay. So here I'm going to use new technology to show you how things vary and how solutions vary for the same problem. So airplanes, and the problem is we want to make them less air transportation less expensive. Okay, the Airbus decided to develop planes that are bigger and can transport larger numbers of passengers, regardless of whether the price of fuel is going to increase or not. Boeing thought you do it another way. You want to form planes that are fuel efficient, and you can increase the number of flights. But if fuel is less costly, you have solved the problem too. So two alternative ways of solving the transportation cost problem. Okay. And so this is basically how we have operated in mankind. Okay. And this is where I'm going to stop for now, and I'll entertain questions that you may have. There is variation too in writing systems, but I'm not going to discuss that. Okay, so thank you. Are there yet? Yeah, teaching colleagues. So that's it. So I'm ready for questions, and you can come up with whatever else it crossed your mind. And your questions can also refer to things I talked about in previous lectures, because this runs up the line of lectures that I had accepted to give here that illustrates my approach, ecological approach to language evolution.
Vocês podem fazer perguntas e não precisa ser só sobre o tema falado hoje, mas outras questões também sobre questões ecológicas, com abordagem ecológica. Né? So, questions, comments?
Don't be too shy. Before long, I'll be gone, and you won't have the same opportunity. So, yeah, I am with you. Yeah.
Well, I have just not exactly a question, but actually, these days were so enlightening in terms of, information, and it took me back to my undergraduate courses when I was studying what we today call hard linguistics.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that you go beyond that in many ways. But my comment is not a question, it's just to say thank you for taking part of your precious time. I know that you're very busy and being here with us for about 2 weeks, but this course was, in many ways, I think for people who are here and people who are online, I think was for many, for some was a refreshment, for those who are more familiar with your theories, and of course, the field of linguistics is so rich and so enticing in many ways. So having a scholar of your caliber with us makes us feel very proud, and I want to thank you for this wonderful course that we had and that we finished today. If I just would like to know your opinion based on when you're talking about culture a language being one manifestation of culture. What would you say? This is a discussion that we've been having for many years. So is it possible to become bilingual and not bicultural? What do you think? We have these discussions, just to complement.
Yes.
We have these discussions when we are learning a foreign language, for example.
Yeah.
And then once you learn a foreign language in an expanding circle country where the language does not circulate, as happens in other settings, we've always had this discussion, especially when it goes through the idea that can we become bilingual and not necessarily bicultural. So I'd like to hear you on this issue.
I think it depends on the social ecology in which you become bilingual.
Uh-huh.
I learned French when I was in the Congo. I grew up there until the age of 26.
Mm-hmm.
And when I arrived in France and could speak French, I realized there was a lot of French culture I didn't know. And until now, the year that I'm spending in France is helping me acquire more of the French culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so language alone couldn't really instill French culture in me, although what I have to admit is that I read a lot of things that were different from my culture, but I couldn't really internalize those things from the books.
Right.
On the other hand, I have learned a lot of English while operating in the United States. And what I have noticed is that when I go back to the Congo, people tell me I have Americanized. In other words, I have acquired cultural practices
Uh-huh.
that are different from my heritage cultural practices. And so that's why I think the real answer lies in the setting in which you acquire the other language and develop this capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are programs in second language acquisition that try to teach you quite a bit of the other culture, but as I said earlier, it's difficult to internalize the other culture if you don't live in the environment where it is practiced.
And also because, sorry, interrupting. Yeah. And also because what we learn, for example, what we learn from books, basically what they bring is basically very stereotypical, right?
Right.
So, and very general when it comes, for example, to what we would call American culture or British culture. So,
right. And the other, yes, and you are very right. Here I have an example. My daughter learned French in Chicago.
uh-huh.
She went to an elite school where they taught French very well. And then we went on vacation. We went to Paris on vacation. And then she said, Daddy, I want to go to a briocherie. So briocherie is the kind of bakery shop where they specialize in brioche.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time when we were there in France, the people that we talked to didn't have a sense of any store that specializes only on brioche. And she would insist there must be briocheries here in Paris. And people would say, you go to the bakers with boulangerie.
Yeah.
So what she thought was part of that French culture. She internalized it in a different, that is, in a way that is different from the local culture in Paris.
Yeah. Thank you.
More questions, comments?
What I want to also highlight is that the lecture that I have given represent my technology. You call hypothesis also technology. And we all want to explain how languages have evolved. And there are alternative explanations. So don't be surprised if you buy a book on language evolution and you see an account that seems to contradict mine. Okay, and that is part of variation. And because we all use language in developing these alternative technologies, we can exchange views across hypotheses, and maybe sometime we will compromise on something that maybe compromise, but we come up with this particular hypothesis like this. Okay, so I don't want to fool you and and leading you to believe that everybody that works on language evolution thinks like me. And I represent the generation of decolonial linguists. So, and I'm proud to do it that way.
Thank you. Today I'm not shy. Yesterday, the other day, I didn't ask. I'm just curious what your opinion is, not about language evolution, but your other theories about colonization. I'm sure you're aware that you're having quite a success in Brazil. Like lots of young researchers, they're using your framework to work on language contact and historical issues in Brazil. And I see it's just spreading, and I see you coming back to Brazil. So it looks like your frameworks are really quite well adapted to this context. I'm just curious, are you aware of this? Like, do you read how your theories and your technologies are used in this context, and what do you make of it? Just because I see a lot of our students in São Paulo, but also here, who are citing you a lot. So how does this go back to you, like this reception that you get in Brazil? It's really just curiosity.
We're talking here about youth language.
I think more in this historical context of like language contact, the formation of Brazilian Portuguese.
Yes.
Yes, like I think your hypotheses are really what's booming at the moment. I don't know if other people can confirm, but it seems to be like what people prefer to work with. Me, myself as well. I've quoted you a lot.
Okay. Regarding language contact, the place where we all forget to start with is the contact between idiolects or among idiolects. How we influence each other. Okay. And my hypothesis is that language transmission is horizontal. And a lot of exchanges take place across idiolects. And we keep reshaping our idiolects as we go, borrowing from different kinds of people and reshaping. And the other people are reshaping the idiolects too. It's really a world of complexity. So if we are stable enough in the environments where we evolve, the differences among us can be reduced. But there are nonetheless cases even if you live in the same household, you sometimes don't understand each other. Okay. So, and you have to ask the other person to explain if you want to cooperate, or you turn away in anger if you don't want to cooperate. These things happen. And I co-edited just last year 2 fat volumes, 1,500 pages of on language contact. And the orientation that we took was that they would show how language contact influences language evolution. That if you put the history of mankind in perspective, you will find out that there is no modern language that is not an outcome of language contact at some stage. If you take the European dispersal, the European languages wouldn't have diversified if you don't factor in the fact that the European languages came in contact with pre-European languages. And later on, when you add things such as the Roman Empire, that the Indo-Europeans colonized each other at some point, and the contact between the Latin and the Celtic languages is responsible for the emergence of the Romance languages. And the Romance languages later on get in contact with the so-called indigenous languages in the colonies, and they become transformed, and now we speak of Latin American Spanish, or you may want to be more specific, Argentinian Spanish versus Mexican Spanish, and we speak of Brazilian Portuguese as opposed to Peninsula Portuguese and things like that. So language contact is quite important. Now, as we grow, we align with our peers, and we mostly recognize the period when, as teenagers, we want not to be understood by our parents, and we develop our own jargons or slangs. And what is interesting is that at some point when we graduate into adulthood, we leave behind these slangs. But if you also pay attention, there are elements from youth language that become part of the communal language, and they are contributing to evolution. So the situation is such that we cannot say evolution has stopped. Evolution has not stopped because as we communicate, we are contributing to the evolution of our languages. Only we will not live long enough to tell to what extent our languages will have changed, say, 100 years from now. But that would be partly a consequence of the ways in which we communicate today. Something that we may want to pay attention to is how we use the telephone to communicate with each other. Something that has intrigued me is that you have a friend that is far away and you get in contact with them by telephone. But many people, especially the younger ones, prefer to text rather than speak on the telephone. I want to understand why. For me, I think if you speak, you can say more and you can be more explicit. But if you write, you are under pressure to keep your utterances, your sentences short and get the message across. But there is a whole lot that is missing. How is this going to affect our linguistic communication in the future? And some people have been creative. Now they resort to emotics. But because the emotics are bringing in the written form, in the graphic form, the paralanguage that usually gets lost in text. And so texting is bringing writing closer to speaking. Are we going to become a new breed of human beings that will depend so much on the telephone to transmit messages, that we will be talking less and less with each other? In which direction are things evolving? We don't know. Evolution is a science of the past. It is not a science of the future. We don't engage in those speculations because we don't know what other ecological factors are going to influence the kinds of things that I have described here. So that is really an open question. I don't know whether that answers your question.
I also have a question.
Yeah,
Because you have a different perspective of how the nature of language if
yeah,
you compare with the generative grammar.
yeah,
But we also have many scholars from the generative framework that have propositions that seems to match your analysis and what you propose about it. So I would like to hear a little bit what you think about this.
yeah. Well, I want to make clear I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater when I bash generative linguistics. It's like generative linguistics didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater in bashing structuralism. There are a lot of things in structuralism that are kept in generative linguistics. Then there are certainly a number of things in generative linguistics that we cannot dispute. But there are certain aspects of linguistics in general, generative or what, that we have to step back and re-examine. What is the significance of rules? Are they really rules, or are the rules just an attempt to capture patterns? We have to be clear on that. Do the rules of syntax, as we work on them, have psychological reality? And I go even further. Would linguistics have evolved the same way if linguistics had emerged in a non-literate society? A whole lot of what we do in linguistics is a byproduct of doing writing on paper. And we draw all this diagram because that's the best way. What would have things been like if we had invented computers before we as humans and could use other options that the computers allow to us? We speak of constituent structures, and first, the constituents are ways of grouping things, but there are like discontinued phrases, like I pick up the telephone versus I pick the telephone up. Okay. So in order to account for the identity of meaning between the two sentences, I have to devise some scheme to show that the up in one position came from another position. But in speaking, it could just be a matter of alternative ways of expressing things, but of course it is constrained by some other principles. So the principles needn't be rules, and I think the term constraint in syntax makes more sense than the term rule. And with a computer, you can show the relationship between up and the verb pick by, for instance, showing a different kind of connection without positing some sort of movement. Okay. And the way we do it is like putting things just too much in a linear order. Whereas when we speak, if you pay attention, we don't have time to plan the content of what we are going to say before we open our mouths. Everything goes together. At some point, you have to start to see if then the speaking part, or if the speaking part is going faster, you have to start and wait until you're complete. But the thing is interfacing in parallel processing makes more sense to me than the way we have been doing these things. And if you had to learn syntax the way I did in the 1970s, and you pass a sentence, you start with S and then you have NP to the left and VP to the right, and then you keep going down. And then eventually you have to fill in the terminal nodes with verbs and with words. Then you say, this is a backward way. Why would you start passing an abstraction before you get to the words? On the other hand, if you start with the words only, you cannot make it either to the top. Because the words come in a linear order. There must be some other way that things are being processed in the mind that we haven't figured out yet. And this is where people that do computer modeling can help us. Because the computer doesn't really operate in the same way that our mind operates. And somehow, be the computer, because there is some sort of immersion systems of self-organization. Yes, kind of self-organization that emerges in the way the computer works. Maybe that can give us hints about how the mind works. On the other hand, the computer fails in so many ways because the computer can really not generate sentences in the ways that we humans do with so much flexibility. And somehow, between the shortcomings and the successes of the computer, we can come up with a more realistic idea of how things work in the mind. And so this is just my position. So I think that linguistics has been a little bit too abstract and too theoretical.
More questions or comments? So if you don't have more questions, I'm calling Cristina because she has some last words.
You can use this as a microphone to translate.
So then I'll play the interpreter here.
Yes.
Boa tarde a todos, né? Eu não falei pessoalmente com todos. Eu fiquei em nome do programa, né? Eu sou coordenadora do PPGI, do Programa de Pós-Graduação, né?
So good afternoon, everybody. This is Cristina Figueiredo. She's our coordinator of the program in Language and Culture.
Eu gostaria de agradecer ao professor Santo, né, Sali, por ter se disponibilizado a vir para o Brasil compartilhar.
So I'd like to thank Professor Lefeni for taking 2 weeks of his time to come to Brazil.
Para o Brasil, e especialmente aqui para o nosso programa, né, e compartilhar essa teoria, né, que a gente vinha estudando há algum tempo, mas que com a sua presença realmente vai ajudar nossas pesquisas, né? Nós temos...
So for taking your time to come here to share with us your theory that, according to Cristina, they have been studying for some time already.
Nós temos aqui alguns professores de um grupo que trabalham com línguas em contato, inclusive eu.
So we have some professors here who have been working with languages in contact, including herself.
E por isso a sua presença aqui é muito importante, foi muito importante para nós, né?
And because of this, your presence here was very important for us.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much
Pela sua presença e
for your presence.
agora eu gostaria de falar para o público.
And I would like to address the public.
Eu queria agradecer a presença de todos, né? Eu acho que, como a Lilian disse,
I'd like to thank everybody for your presence, and as Lilian said,
a gente conseguiu um público aqui, né, de docente interessante e
we
que a gente
got a nice audience of professors here,
e que nós vamos conseguir compartilhar, né, divulgar com nossos alunos toda essa teoria do professor que
and we'll be able to share with our students all this Professor Fanny's theory,
e que vai inovar bastante a nossa pesquisa.
and we'll innovate our research.
Eu gostaria também de agradecer
I'd also like to thank
ao programa CapSprint, que foi o que permitiu que a gente trouxesse o professor Confluente.
so the Copy Sprint program, which was through this program
E,
that we were able to invite Professor Fanny to come.
e convidar os professores aqui presentes, né, a também trazer outros pesquisadores estrangeiros
And invite our professors here or maybe online to engage in the same project to bring other scholars to our institute.
e nós temos um edital que fecha amanhã, né, e que seria interessante que houvesse pedidos para que a gente continuasse com a internacionalização.
And we have a call for proposals that the deadline is tomorrow. So then, as a coordinator, Christina says it's important for us to have, to submit proposals, to have more scholars like Professor Buffani coming to UFMA.
Thank you very much.
Thank
for those-
you.
Thank you very much for those kind words. It's been a pleasure for me to be here. I have enjoyed every moment of it. And believe it or not, it has given me an opportunity to relax my mind a little bit because I sit longer here than I do in Paris or in Chicago. Also, I have a strong attachment to the Global South. And as a chair of the Global South, I think that what I have accomplished should be beneficial to the Global South. And I'm so happy when I'm invited to the Global South, as long as people can pay for my airfare and for my room and board. So I wouldn't do it under the same conditions for the Global North. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bem, antes de nos despedirmos agora, eu queria convidar vocês também para ver a palestra amanhã, vai haver uma mesa com a presença do professor Sônico Confluente e também com o Alexandre Combinati, que está aqui presente, professor da USP. E nós vamos falar um pouco mais sobre temas relacionados ao curso, então eu acredito que seja de interesse de todos vocês. Convidem também seus alunos, vai ser amanhã nessa mesma sala, 1h30. Obrigada a todos.